clear that the EU, because it's a much more open system than compared to the China and the US, benefited more from the open multilateral system, but is also much more likely to be hurt by its breakdown here. So that's why discussing this topic in terms of what should be the reaction of Europe, should it also resort to closing its borders, or should it find partners to fight for this open multilateral system? That's the big topic. What does strategic autonomy mean? How do we need to translate that into a long-run sustainable strategy for Europe? We're very happy to have three very great speakers to deal with this. You need great minds to talk about these great topics here. So we have one who will kickstart is Mr. Valdis Dombrovskis. We're very happy to have you here. He is everybody knows him, so I can be very short on introducing here. So he's the Vice President of the European Commission, also in charge of trade. He was trained in economics, but economics for engineers, and also has a degree in physics. So rather than just talking about problems, he also likes to solve problems from an engineering perspective. So we're very much looking forward to his contribution. The second in line is then Mr. Fabio Panetti. He is on the ECB, on the executive board, and responsible for international and European relations, so also definitely well placed to discuss the EU reaction to these global trends. Prior, he was, among others, the deputy governor of the Banca d'Italia. And then, last but not least, we have Florence Beaune, who is the Minister of State for European Affairs in France, but is also well known for her work at OECD as a chief economist and the deputy secretary General. And she is also very well known for her work at the World Bank and IMF high-level advisory group on sustainable recovery and inclusive growth. So also obviously very well placed to talk here. So with these three great speakers, I'm not going to take too much time more, and now give the floor to Vice President Dombrovskis for kicking off with some first remarks.
So, good morning, everyone, and first of all, thank you for invitation to this event. We have entered a new era of geopolitics. Russia's relentless war against Ukraine has forced the European Union, along with the democratic world, to deal with dramatically altered international circumstances. One can say that regional and interconnected power play has been happening for some time, but now geopolitical goalposts have shifted like never before. So, as ECB says in its paper on open strategic autonomy, the world has moved from a dominant narrative favoring an open multilateral international order to narrative in which geopolitical considerations are having an increased impact on the economy. And I would say we share this assessment with also an European Commission. What we see is that economic challenges and fragmentation risks are increasing. But at the same time, one can say that while globalization has entered a new phase, it is not ending. The paradigm of economic strength through trade, efficiency through trade, mutual gains through trade is still valid. On the future of a multilateral trading system, we should return to why rules-based system and WTO are so important. We need both also as quadrails against policies of might is right. The better the WTO works, the more rules are respected, and the more rules are respected, the greater is also EU's economic security. It must be remembered that WTO remains a central pillar of international trade. For the EU, close to 60% of our trade is still under WTO tariffs. So this is why EU and others too are investing time and effort in the reform of organization. At the time of heightened geopolitical tension, joining hands with friends and partners is more important than ever. And it's not only using our trade agenda to pursue our geopolitical, economic, and sustainability objectives, but we are also rethinking EU partnerships around the world, reinforcing relations with reliable partners and key growth regions. Trade is key to our resilient and sustainable economic success. As you know, we have reshaped our trade policy around the concept of open strategic autonomy to draw maximum strengths from the EU's position as a trading superpower. So we aim to be open, sustainable, and assertive. Open because trade must work for our people and economies. Sustainable because trade policy must work for our planet, and assertive because we must defend our values and interests. Well, a few words on the US Inflation Reduction Act, since indeed that concerns our relations with our largest and most important trading partner. Well, I think you are familiar with the concerns EU has on our companies being discriminated against in US markets. And it also undermines the close EU-US cooperation in diversifying and strengthening supply chains for clean tech transition. In a sense, we would be better off if we would be working together on climate change, not against the climate change. And what we see in US Inflation Reduction Act, that it mixes laudable climate ambitions with protectionist industrial policy. So, as you know, we're engaging very intensively with US. I were able to address some of the aspects, discriminatory aspects of Inflation Reduction Act, but obviously there is a need to do more. So, and while we are dealing with all the geopolitical shifts and all the risks of trade fragmentation, we should not lose sight of our long-term growth strategy, which is anchored in two key transformations, so move to climate neutrality and embracing the digital age. So this goes hand in hand with strengthening EU's competitiveness. So for this, we have developed a strategy to provide a more supportive environment for scaling up our manufacturing capacity of net zero technologies. And this will help to secure EU position as a global marketplace. This complements our Green Deal industrial plan, which focuses on net zero industries, and as you may know, it covers regulatory environment, financing, both at EU and national level, skills and open trade, but without threatening a fair competition. And we're also acting to diversify access to critical raw materials, which will be key for green and digital transition. So that's why we have our raw materials strategy to make sure that we have access to the materials we need, both by stepping up domestic production and by diversifying supplies from around the world. And one last point before I conclude my introduction. A competitive economy needs efficient access to private funding to support investments that will underpin future growth. And this is why we need to complete the banking union and make progress on capital markets union. The entire European economy will be stronger and more resilient as a result. Thank you, and I look forward for today's discussion.
Thank you. We will indeed start the discussion, but only after we've heard the others. Thanks for also clarifying this EU open strategy autonomy and how this actually is translated, and particularly also more recently with the reaction to the IRA on the Net Zero Industry Act and the raw materials, and stressing the importance of banking union as important policy actions of this open strategic autonomy perspective. So we give the floor now to Mr. Panetti for his perspectives on this from a
Thank you
ECB
very much
perspective.
for inviting me to this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me start with an advert, actually, too. The comments I will make are based on a very careful and comprehensive analysis of the concept, the implications, and the potential reactions to the fragmentation of the world economy on the basis of projects and strategies based on open strategic autonomy. And this is an occasional paper which has just been published by the European Central Bank. Second advert, a bit more with conflict of interest. My comments are based on a broader speech which is published on the ECB website today. So recent developments have raised the question of how geopolitics will affect global economic relations in the 21st century. History suggests that the world is facing a trilemma whereby peace, open trade, and antagonistic political competition struggle to coexist. Open trade and peace can only be sustained if a stable political, economic, and legal international order supported by common institutions offers a non-conflictual and enforceable way of dealing with disagreements. This lesson was the basis of the creation of multilateral international institutions and European integration after World War II. But in recent years, severe geopolitical tensions have emerged, posing a threat to both peace and trade, and in turn prosperity. In this context, technology is taking a crucial role. It remains a key driver of trade, notably in services. It offers an antidote to the effects of a possible reversal of globalization by making it possible to use scarce resources more effectively and reduce dependencies. And technology supports growth by generating productivity gains. But it may exacerbate political competition as major powers strive for technological dominance. Today, and in the speech that is published on our website, I will argue that closer European integration is the best response to global fragmentation. Let me explain why I say this. Around the turn of the century, we entered in a phase of globalization on steroids, as it has been defined, marked by a considerable increase in trade and the integration of India and China into the world economy. The globalization boom has had positive effects for the global economy overall, as the reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers fostered trade, job creation, innovation, and growth. The European Union has been a major contributor to the open trade system, achieving high levels of economic integration with the rest of the world. But the European Union's reliance on export was not complemented by adequate domestic investment and homegrown innovation. And the current circumstances highlight the significant risks of relying excessively on foreign demand as a growth engine. It can distract from the need to invest domestically and to improve competitiveness, and it can obscure the fact that dependencies on trade linkages can turn into vulnerabilities, allowing foreign players to weaponize them. Therefore, the European Union needs to rely more on domestic demand, like other large advanced economies, and reduce its dependencies. Indeed, the euro area growth model largely relied in the past on the assumption that an open multilateral economic order would continue to prevail in the future, guaranteeing continued access to relatively cheap imported resources, critical raw materials, and technology. Openness was often seen as a substitute for domestic investment in our physical, human, and social capital. It is now clear that these favorable conditions can no longer be taken for granted. We therefore need to rebalance the European Union's growth model. The principle of multilateral cooperation is now facing formidable challenges which are leading to fragmentation in international trade and finance. The shocks that have hit the world economy have exposed the flip side to economic interdependence, which is vulnerability. Geopolitical risks have triggered a flight to safety, and many countries are putting an emphasis on greater autonomy. Protectionist tendencies increased further after COVID-19 pandemic, and they have further intensified still following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The European Union, for decades a champion of openness and integration, has developed its open strategic autonomy agenda in order to prevent dependencies becoming vulnerabilities. Geopolitical tensions and global fragmentation could entail high economic costs. The European Union thus needs to continue working towards safeguarding trade openness while increasing its own resilience to fragmentation. So far, the leveling off of global trade in goods since the great financial crisis can be characterized as a phase of globalization rather than deglobalization. In the services sector, the growth of international trade seems to be signaling a continuation of globalization trends, driven mainly by technological progress. Overall, aggregate data do not point towards deglobalization, at least for now. At the same time, the nature of globalization may be changing. Firms are becoming more inclined towards nearshoring, onshoring, or friendshoring their supply chains, especially for the production of advanced technologies. This new state of affairs poses challenges for the European Union economy and the ECB monetary policy. Weaker trade integration could significantly reduce welfare because our economy is one of the most open and outward-oriented large economies. Its interdependencies could therefore turn into vulnerabilities. Fragmentation may also affect the ECB's monetary policy. Geopolitical shocks may trigger persistent output and inflation volatility, with multiple spillovers. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has, for instance, disrupted energy and commodities markets with major implications for inflation. In this environment, the challenge is to pursue openness while preparing for fragmentation scenarios. The way forward should include at least the following elements. On the external front, the European Union should continue to defend the principle of multilateralism. A trade confrontation would lead to significant losses. We should not shy away from pursuing a more assertive role in fostering global cooperation. We should leverage our large internal market and significant share of global trade, while at the same time strengthening cooperation beyond close partners. The European Union should also diversify its participation in supply chains. Successful partnerships, including with low-income countries, could reduce the risk of value chains fragmenting along geopolitical blocks, especially in areas such as the green transition, where cooperation is vital and critical raw materials play an essential role. The European Union also needs to revisit its growth model, balancing external orientation with homegrown demand. The reasons are threefold. First, to remedy insufficient public investment and structural reforms, for which we should leverage European tools and objectives, as we did for the Next Generation EU. Second, to raise total factor productivity, which requires increasing investment in domestic research and cutting-edge civil and defense technologies. And third, to leverage the complementarity of member states' economies. European integration will also strengthen our ability to influence international developments, where coordinated common EU action can be more effective at global level than isolated moves. Initiatives to deepen economic and monetary union and strengthen the integration of the single market would also make our economy more resilient and stable, especially if backed by an appropriate common fiscal capacity. Such a fiscal capacity would support the necessary investment in EU public goods in areas such as the green transition, digital innovation, and military spending. Policies aimed at increasing our strategic autonomy need to be carefully coordinated to ensure that they do not lead to internal fragmentation themselves. The EU's strategic autonomy framework should avoid a counterproductive reliance on national solutions to global shocks, as this could bring about an internal race for subsidies, inefficient allocation of resources, or unfair competition among European Union member states. Undue protectionist policies that give a competitive edge to domestic industries may trigger beggar-thy-neighbor effects that would undermine trust and openness. Let me briefly conclude, but again, the text of the speech is much richer. Closer European integration is the best response to global fragmentation. It gives us a stronger voice on internal stage to promote cooperation and openness. It provides the necessary scale to invest in technology and capitalize on domestic resources. And it is the right level on which to foster an open strategic autonomy that builds on the single market rather than undermining it. So if I had to explain in a sentence the view which I have tried to express, is that the world is fragmenting and we want to play a bigger role in this ongoing process which could lead to further fragmentation. And to do this, to play a bigger role, to have a more influence on global developments, we must be stronger internally. We must integrate to have a stronger voice internationally. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think this side of the panel really seems to agree on open strategic autonomy. In order to realize that closer integration within Europe is the cornerstone in order to be more resilient and to be able to rely more on internal demand and also to be more assertive on the global scene here. So let's see whether this side of the table also shares this view of closer integration as the solution for Europe to be open, strategic, and autonomous.
But of course, I really wonder why you're asking this question. And I'm sure it's not because I'm French. Okay, thanks. Thanks for the invitation. It's actually a great pleasure to be here and see many friendly faces. And a lot has been said before, so I will avoid repeating what Valdis and Fabio have been saying. I think we have very similar view, and I'm going to try and push for where I think, where France thinks the EU should be doing a bit more. So the real message I want to give you today is there is more geoeconomics or economic security or economic statecraft, whatever name you want to use, in Europe already than what people tend to think. And we're not far from the US or others. The second thing is, and Fabio mentioned it in his conclusion, if we want to be a reliable partner in the world, we need to be strong and we need to have a predictable doctrine on what is economic security. And the third is, as I was saying, we have already done a lot. We need to complete it, and I will suggest some words for this. Okay, so where do we go from here? Just before giving you the structure of how we see the doctrine, let me just insist on two things that Fabio and Valdis have been saying. The main difference, I think, between us and others is we are open to trade within the rules-based global governance. And I think that is especially important when it is being challenged. And that's what distinguishes us from other big power. Okay, so what are the pillars of our economic security strategy or doctrine? The first one, I won't surprise you, it's obviously competitiveness. And here both Fabio and Valdis have been mentioning it. There are two things I would like to insist on. One is completing the capital market union. It's not only something we've been saying for decades, but it is about channeling financial flows to productive investment. And that's why it's so important, especially to avoid fragmentation. And the second thing under the competitiveness pillar is competency. We sometimes forget that Europe is at full employment, each of our country or close to, and we have labor shortages. We need more talent for everything that we need to do. The second pillar of this doctrine is industrial policy. And to get back to your introduction, this used to be a very French word, but I think it has become a very European one. So what is industrial policy? Both have mentioned it. I think it's because we can't be a strong geopolitical power if we are not a strong economic power. And for this, we've been pushing under the French presidency, but the Commission has been delivering as well a lot on accelerating on digital technology, energy transition, and I think health. Industrial policy also very important. And here Valdis has been mentioning the various elements from the critical raw material to Net Zero Industry Act, so I won't add on this. But the second pillar, industrial policy, is key to be a strong geopolitical power. The third one, I think, is about not being naive, but ensuring that we have fair competition on what is our most precious common public good in the EU, the single market. And to ensure fair competition here, we have tools. We have anti-subsidies tools, we have anti-dumping tools, we have screening of inbound foreign direct investment. And that's hyper precious because you want a level playing field within the single market. We've used them, and for example, the cycle industry is actually very vibrant because we've been using those tools. The fourth pillar is reciprocity. As you mentioned, we are open, but we are not naive, so we're open to two things. First, to strategic trade, and I'll come back to this, and then it has implication for public procurement. When I mention reciprocity, our public market have been largely open. Some third countries' public market have been largely closed, and public market is about 14% of EU GDP. So no third country will be able to access our public market if we don't have access to theirs. That's not being protectionist, that's ensuring, that's demanding reciprocity in openness. The other thing is trade agreement. We have recently been signing the trade agreement with New Zealand, partly because it was strategic, there were balanced concessions, and they were respecting the environmental clauses. And that's exactly the type of trade agreement we should be requesting: strategic, balanced concessions, and respecting our environmental and social clauses. Which is also why France will not be very happy with the Mercosur as long as we don't have these three strategic elements in it. And finally, the fifth one, so just after competitiveness, defense of the single market, reciprocity, and industrial policy. The fifth one is partnership and influence. We need to promote more our standards beyond the EU border, not only when we're doing business, but also when we're doing development aid. And we should obviously not forget what development aid is for, but it also has to be accompanied with some demand on our environmental, social values standard. Okay, so we have these 5 pillars, and as I was saying, quite a lot has been done. And I haven't mentioned all the tools, but Fabio talked about being assertive. We have sanctions, we have foreign subsidies regulation, and many. What we need now is to move to the implementation phase, okay? Because enforcement is essential to ensure our credibility. And I think European institutions have to dedicate the time and the resources for it. That's super important. It's not that we want to antagonize any partners with similar values. It's not about shutting down. It is about remaining open for business and being strategic and aligned with our interests. So we're looking, France is looking at 3 areas for improvement of our toolbox for the EU to reflect this new geopolitical order. First one, FDI screening should be strengthened because currently it is mostly done at the national levels and with loopholes. We know the regulation will be revised by the end of the year, but I think it must be strengthened to do 2 things. First, to improve EU coordination. Again, it's too piecemeal, too national, And second, to make sure that it covers all strategic assets and infrastructures in the EU. Second area for improvement, export control. In my view, the EU should complete its doctrine on which technologies it is willing to export and to where. The current doctrine only targets dual-use exports as a priority that should be expanded. And on a related topic, we're also looking forward to the Commission proposal on outbound investment screening, which has been announced by the President von der Leyen in her recent speech. There should be a discussion on this. And the third area for improvement is external partnership and development aid. I think we have some way to go in making a better use of tools like development aid. China is scaling up its investment in the global south. It's focusing on commodities, land, and infrastructure. And let me give you two killer numbers. In Africa, 1 in 2 large-scale infrastructure projects is being built by a Chinese company, 1 in 2. And 1 in 3 is being funded by a Chinese bank. The EU, I think, has not yet designed a comprehensive strategy to coordinate its development aid. The global gateway could be the European tool to use development aid in a strategic manner, but for this, it has to be focused, it has to be accelerated to hope to offer a credible alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think there's some work to do, but we can do it, and we have the strength for that. I'm going to quote something from Valdis' website. Europe is about 440 million consumers with a GDP per head of 25,000 euros a year. This is the largest economic region in the world. It's the first trading bloc. It's the first region for inbound investment. It's the first for outbound for indirect investment. We have 80 trading partners. The US has 20. So we can do a lot to be a very reliable and predictable partner with a good doctrine on economic security. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So that was a very interesting intervention. You also, of course, emphasize open strategic autonomy, but quite a lot has been done already. And the question is, in the implementation, are we doing enough? And really suggesting also some improvements, very concrete in terms of FDI screening, export controls, outbound investment screening, better use of development aid. You also all stressed the importance of industrial policy and a new perspective on this, with access to finance being a very important dimension to assure competitiveness of our companies here. But part of the new industrial policy is also much bigger use of subsidies as a policy instrument here next to regulation. But these subsidies, I was wondering, particularly within the green area, because this is a very pivotal one for Europe, do we then also need to revise the subsidy schemes treatment within the multilateral agreement here? So do we need to reconsider what are good and what are bad environmental subsidies or not here, including, and with subsidies also including the procurement instrument, which is also pretty important for environments here. So I would like to go back to one round internally among our panel participants before we move to the overall Q&A here. So how do you think these particular instruments in the toolbox should be adopted or not? Adapted or not, and changed within this open strategic autonomy here to ensure that we can have assertiveness and openness at the same time here. So, Valdis, can you start again?
Yeah, thank you for this question. First of all, indeed, as it has already been noted, in recent years we have developed our toolbox of autonomous measures in quite a broad range of areas. Many elements have been mentioned already. What I would highlight is, for example, the revised enforcement regulation which we have in force, FDI screening instrument, where indeed so to say the balance, political balance, which was achieved during the previous round of negotiations, leaves a lot of discretion for member states, and not all member states have their FDI screening mechanisms in place yet even. Anti-coercion instrument, definitely a very important element. We now are indeed starting this work on economic security strategy, where agrees that basically two things. First, that we need to define, so what is economic security, so what we are really talking on, and it's important that it's risk-based, so we are also specify, so what are the specific risks we want to address, and then we see what tools are needed to address these specific risks. So also on sustainability part, we have developed our toolbox in recent years with a review of trade and sustainable development chapters in our trade negotiations, with deforestation regulation, with due diligence regulation, with now the legislative proposal on forced labor. Also right now we are discussing the review of general system of preferences, where indeed we are strengthening the link of providing unilateral trade concessions with recipient countries, also observing certain environmental and social standards, so strengthening this dimension. So I would say many things have been done in recent years, and I would say very timely, as now indeed we see that the geopolitical context is becoming more problematic, more conflictual. We are better equipped to defend our interests and values if it's necessary. So from that point of view, one can say that this concept of open strategic autonomy means that we are open for a free and fair rules-based trade whenever possible, but we are able to defend our interests autonomously if necessary.
Yeah, thanks. So indeed, it's rules-based that should ensure a level playing field, not only internally but also externally. So the rules that we currently have are sufficient to be enforced and to improve in implementation, or do we also need a more drastic revision of the rules and at the multilateral level?
In terms of rules, we were mentioning some elements which are still in development. For example, we are indeed now starting this discussion on outbound investment screening. We will be having a review of FDI screening, kind of a inward investment screening. We will be still discussing this concept of economic security and what are the risks and how to address them. So many things are done, and they can be implemented if necessary, and already are being implemented. But there are still further things which we need to do, and in any case we need to stay agile and we need to be able to react as we see situation evolving and probably new risks or disbalances emerging.
Very clear. So, Mr. Panetta, do you think that open strategic autonomy can be reached with the framework that we currently have, and better implementing it, or do you think we need more?
In part, yes. In part, no. But first of all, let me reiterate one concept that I have expressed in my introduction. The global economy is becoming more polarized. This means that for small players, life is more difficult today than it was in the past. And so we have to become stronger, and we have to consider carefully our strategic interest. Second, in this world, we do not be only reactive, but also proactive. This is already happening. There's a lot of discussion about the IRA and what we could do in reaction to this move by the United States. But a lot has already been done. Incentives for the green transition have been already provided with the RRF, with the Repower EU. Of course, we can do more, but we should continue to and we should take the IRA as a stimulus to do more in this front. Third, is everything fine? Well, I'm not sure, because we should have jointly a discussion on how to become stronger and how to upgrade European governance. Because I think that if we proceed with good measures, sometimes without a clear, consistent plan of what else is necessary, we may not be as efficient as we could be. Let me give you one example. Both Valdis and Laurence have mentioned that in order to fund investment, we need sufficient financing. Two comments here. First, in order to achieve this, we must have the capital markets union, the banking union, but we should reflect on why we don't get the capital markets union or the banking union, in spite of many efforts for many years. I spent the last 10 years discussing banking union and capital markets union. Maybe there's something else is necessary beyond, asking that this should be, these projects should be completed. I have the impression that until we progress towards a common fiscal capacity, we will not achieve these two goals. Why? Well, because the banking union has stopped when we started discussing issues that are closely related to fiscal, the DGS, for example. And this is, or the treatment of sovereigns. We know that two countries have felt very strong of not going beyond a certain point when we were discussing the completion of the banking union, precisely on how to treat the DGS, which would become close to the sovereign, to fiscal policy, and on the treatment of sovereign exposures. The capital market union, well, I have no, I think there is no experience looking into the past of a well-developed capital market which has not been developed around a safe asset, which is by definition a sovereign asset. And until we get something similar also in the euro area, it's very difficult to build all what is generally around the safe asset in a developed capital market. Because if you don't have the core, it's very difficult to build what is necessary beyond the core. So I think we should continue discussing and improving the very good measures along the lines mentioned by both Valdis and Laurence. But we should not forget this has to be built with a stronger European Union. And this requires more integration, progress towards a full-fledged union, monetary, but also banking, capital markets, and in the end fiscal, because these four elements stand together or they do not stand. And I think that this discussion has been a bit obscured by the developments of the last few years. We were all busy in reacting to developments, to shocks, to the war, to the pandemic, and we have lost sight. I think that there's been the perception that we should move forward. The approval of the NGO was a big step forward. And I think that it is the consequence of the awareness that in order to react to the fragmentation of the global economy, we must have a bigger domestic market. How do you get a bigger domestic market? Well, by making sure that all parts of the euro area develop. Maybe I will say something more on this because I don't want to take too much time now, but we have already started to act without, in my view, full awareness of the importance of growing more our domestic economy and to rebalance the importance of the export sector vis-a-vis the domestic economy.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So indeed, so lots going on, but still a more proactive role for the EU here and an upgrading of our EU governance with, as a good example, more governance and more proactive on the monetary, banking and fiscal integration. So what's your perspective on this or in general on the comments?
So I obviously cannot agree more with Fabio and Vladis. What Fabio was just saying remind me of Jack O'Sullivan's speech in foreign policy in 2020, which was very much about both this rebalancing and the strategic doctrine. So I think if I take a French view of what the EU is doing on this, it's really about being strong, being able to play on par with the US and China and other regions of the world, and not entering in a block logic, but really have a view which is predictable, where our actions are predictable, and people can see where we want to stand. And we are obviously have shared value with the US. We have also strategic interests which sometimes may differ. Let me mention three things. On the doctrine, I think first, this is very recent, right? You talked about being more proactive. It's true. We have had, in the space of 2 weeks, a speech from President Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, and Joseph Borrell about this issue. So, and that is the last 2 weeks, not last summer. But that's been very interesting. And we're moving away from a doctrine of economic statecraft, which was very military oriented, to something that is strategic and economic and in a very mature way. The second thing is we talked about tools and enforcement, and there's been talk about governance and safe asset. Let me say two things. Let me reiterate first that enforcement is key. It's, as Valdis was highlighting, we have been having these tools for many time. We have not used them for the photovoltaic industry, and we've lost the photovoltaic industry completely. We have used them for the bike industry, and we have not lost the bike industry. I think it's about 130,000 jobs in Europe. We have a big challenge, which is electric vehicle. And China is moving very fast, and so we must use our anti-subsidies and anti-dumping tools and all the tools we have for trade defense to check on this. And again, it's about fair competition. It's not about protectionism. That's one thing I wanted to say on this. The second is about the way that we approach the green transition, right? I think it's been balanced in the way that we're using tax and subsidies, because you ask about subsidies. We've used we European and we French believe in market forces. So you have supply and demand, and that gives you a price. And if the price is high, demand is coming down, and that's why we're taxing carbon. But we're also providing subsidies to help research and development and deployment of green capacity faster. And I think that's to be kept in mind. Again, it's very market-oriented, what we do here. Which brings me, if we talk about carbon tax, we talk about own resources, and then I can move to what Fabio was saying about fiscal capacity. Because obviously we have Next Generation EU, which is supposed to be temporary, and I think there is still a lot more work to do on own resources. I'm not sure we're ready on this, and it's coming along. We want to use more the European Investment Bank to invest in climate, and so the private sector can leverage on public money. But that also raises the question of the capital of the European Investment Bank. And there will be the European contribution to Ukraine reconstruction. And as we know, that's going to be a lot of financial flows. So more short, at about the same time, we've also said that if there was not enough financial funds going to the strategic sectors I mentioned earlier, digital technology, green transition and health, there is still the sovereign fund that the Commission, the sovereignty fund, that the Commission will be presenting in June. So yes, at some stage, I think we will be asking again about the public side of investment, not least with the forthcoming economic governance reform.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So indeed, a call from all of us on this panel here for a more active Europe here, proactive. And usually we do this when we challenged with bigger threats here, and then we can be indeed more proactive. But I think what's also very important is we have to do it in our own European fashion here, and not just mimicking whatever is going on here, but really be proactive in our own European, doing our own homework in terms of which are the areas where we are strong and can develop this strength here, and also in the European way, with, like, for instance, the example of the combination of carbon pricing and subsidies as the European way, which is a much more effective way than just only focusing on subsidies, what the US is doing here. So I would now like to turn to the Q&A session. Of course, there are plenty of questions from digital, but I think the ones who are brave enough to come here get first priority here. So first we will deal with the questions internally, and then if there is still time, with the digital ones here. So we have a running mic. So I forgot who was... but try to be short, because there's so many questions.
Kurt Geisert, I'm one of the guides in the House of European History. I have a question for the Vice President of the European Commission. You will meet the Minister of Commerce of China today. You have heard about the interview the Chinese ambassador to France gave on Friday, special status of Ukraine, special status of Baltic states. Do you intend to speak about this with the Minister of Commerce?
Yeah. Okay, so we collect a few questions that will be more efficient. So we have... Oh.
Good morning, Jorge Valero with Bloomberg. Following up on that question, I would like to ask to Ms. Bon if they intend to summon the French-Chinese ambassador in Paris, following this comment. Secondly, if she could elaborate a bit more on what she said about the export controls to unify the doctrine. I mean, whether you're discussing these ideas with other member states, at what Vice President Dombrovskis think about this. And finally, whether, I mean, on the fiscal rules, if since this was already mentioned during the panel discussion as well, whether you have found already position on this famous common numerical benchmark, and the proposal will be put forward this Wednesday. Thank you.
Finbar Birmingham from the South China Morning Post newspaper. Question for Minister Bon. There has been a lot of coverage of the trips to China by President Macron and von der Leyen. Can you tell us whether the government of France is fully behind President von der Leyen's strategy of de-risking, and whether, in theory, I know we're waiting to see the proposal, in theory, would you back targeted outbound investment screening to protect sensitive issues in, sensitive industries in the European Union? Thank you.
Okay, so I think we one more, and then we, yeah, okay.
Hi, my name is Bert Heck from BBVA, the Spanish bank, and I've got a question concerning a particular project to strengthen the EU strategic autonomy, which is the digital euro. Was announced like that, and the question goes to you, Mr. Panetta, of course. To what extent does it really hold up to this aspiration, the project, that it will strengthen the international role of the Europe, of the euro and of Europe, in particular, since in its initial phase it is intended, if I understand right, rather towards the internal retail use case and not so much for global international interaction?
Yep, has to come from the financial sector. The question on digital markets. We have one urgent question left from the floor, and then we turn to the FIN.
Thank you, Jack Schickler from CoinDesk. I also have a question about the digital euro, mainly for Mr. Panetta. There was quite a lot of skepticism about that project expressed in the European Parliament last week. Do you hope to convince members of the European Parliament of the benefits of this project? And do you worry they might vote it down if you do not?
Yeah, okay. So I think we have enough questions for the panel to pick on what they want to reply to. So, Mr. Dombrovskis, if you want to start.
Yeah, well, indeed. So I'm meeting later today Chinese Trade Minister Wang to discuss a broad range of topics. So clearly we are going to focus on our economic and trade relations, which remain imbalanced, and actually just last year EU was having a record high trade deficit with China, approaching 400 billion euros. So we really need to work to make our trade and economic relations more balanced and more reciprocal. Clearly, we'll be having discussions also on other subjects, including Russia's aggression against Ukraine and export controls and prevention of circumvention of those export controls. And clearly, as regards the statements of China's ambassador in France, those are clearly unacceptable. So clearly I will be raising this with a minister, seeking clarifications, whether that represents a personal view of the ambassador or some shift in China's policy. As regards fiscal rules, well, indeed, we are now preparing the legislative proposal for this Wednesday, so things are broadly on track in this regard. As you know, this was in a sense one of the last balances we had to find in these discussions. On one hand, providing more flexibility for member states to determine their fiscal adjustment path, that coupled with stronger enforcement, but on the other hand, preserving the transparency and equal treatment of member states, and that's where those discussions also on a common numerical benchmark came in. I hope by now we have reached the balanced solution, which we'll be able to present in 2 days' time.
Yeah, that's always the challenge, finding the right balance. Mr. Panetti, you want to reply to some of the questions that were addressed? Or you leave the floor first too?
As you like. Okay, so nobody asked why I argue that we should strengthen the domestic economy. If you don't ask next time, I give you the answer anyway. So, but on the digital euro, yes, this is a project that started because of domestic objectives, triggered by domestic objectives. Currently, European citizens use to a large extent for their purchases, but the use of cash is decreasing. On top of this, the economy is becoming more and more digitalized, so there is a possibility that in the future, if citizens want to do payments at the shop or online, they cannot do it with public money, with sovereign money. So this is why the European Central Bank, the Euro system, started this project to be able to provide central bank money also in a not so close future in which the use of cash would be less common or more difficult because the economy would have become more digital. Also, we are a strange monetary union, a monetary union in which no single means of payment can be used everywhere in the euro area, because there are parts of the euro area where cash is not used almost at all, and also we still have many millions of European citizens that do not have access to financial services. So we thought that a digital euro could be a way to address these three problems. But of course, these are not the only potential positive consequences of the introduction of a digital euro. And clearly, sovereignty is a very important potential benefit. Why? Well, already now, we know that in digital payments, which are becoming, as I said before, more and more common, 2/3 of the payments, of the transactions, are intermediated by foreign players. large US card schemes or a digital services company. But this is not precisely in exactly the definition of strategic autonomy one would have, because when you have control of the payment market by foreign companies, you must be ready to agree that foreign players could have access to highly confidential information. This is fine, but maybe there could be better situations. Also, we are trying to progress in the project on a digital euro because of future potential risks. Suppose that a large foreign country, large economy, becomes more and more international, opens its current account, its financial sector, and in a world in which finance is becoming increasingly digitalized, having access to digital services, wholesale and retail, becomes a competitive advantage. How can we rule out that that country would become dominant in the international financial landscape? This is not a risk that is imminent. This is not a risk that is behind the corner. But it is not science fiction either. And I try, when I get this question, to explain the type of risks we are running with the example of the past, when the dollar took over as the global reserve currency, replacing the pound. The pound has been the global reserve currency until World War I. After World War I, it became clear that the economic and military superpower was not the UK anymore, with all due respect with my UK friends, but it had become the US. And the dollar took over, and it is now a dominant reserve currency. And of course, I think it's fair to say that the importance, the influence, the relevance of the United States without the dollar would be lower. So I think we should be ready to react in that situation to potential risks. Why should we start now? Well, because to get ready to issue a digital currency that would serve 20 different countries with 20 different banking systems, with 20 different regulations, with 25 best standards, because some countries think they have 2 best standards. So you have to start getting ready quite early. It takes a lot of time. So this is not something you can realize one day and dream of reacting the next day. You have to get ready. The project is about getting ready. And you should be aware that this is similar initiatives are being conducted by all the major central banks globally. According to the BIS, there are more than 90 central banks that are working on a potential retail CBDC, including the US, the UK, China has already issued, Bank of Japan, Sweden. I could list all the major central banks, and they're all working, they're all reflecting on whether they should issue a retail CBDC. I don't get skepticism from the European Parliament. I may be an optimist, but I think they are rightly interested in understanding the details, because this is a very powerful instrument. If we manage to design it well, it can bring a lot of benefits to the European people, to the European economy. If we make mistakes, it could be big damage. We will not make mistakes, but it is good that others want to check this.
Yeah, I think we can devote a whole new event on the topic of digital euro. Here, plenty want to say something, but maybe you too, but you can also reply to some of the other questions.
I know I leave the digital euro
yes,
to
thank you. To the other event, yeah.
So I think, and it's to answer your question about the president of France and Ursula von der Leyen. As you know, they went to China together, so they had a lot of time to talk, and I think that's the main message that we've been sending here, which is that we need a predictable doctrine. We have a lot of tools. They're going to be put alongside those 5 pillars, and then there are things that we need to complete And precisely what we need to complete is export control and FDI inbound and outbound. And the Commission will make some proposal. There is also, at the moment, the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Europe are working together on those issues and the doctrine, and they will exchange with the Commission about, what are their proposals looking forward. I think it's super important that we have a common position on this, that we can have a consensus within the 27 and the Commission, because this is about preserving the integrity of the single market, and internally, and also, if 26 countries do one thing and the 27 do something different, then obviously we're losing in efficacy. So it's a practical matter. On China, it happens that the ambassador has one of his usual meetings at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs this afternoon, and obviously it will be said to him that we are not very happy in quite a firm way on this occasion.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So I will now slide in a few questions from the Slido here. So there is a most popular question is on what would be the main one policy that would really advance the capital market union here, but I'd like to tie it immediately also to the question of to which extent EU green bonds could be that one policy issue, particularly because we were talking about green industrial policy, problem of access to finance, solved partly by subsidies, but could EU green bonds be an alternative EU answer for green industrial policy that would be more effective in combination with subsidies and carbon taxes here? Does anybody wants to say anything on how EU green bonds would be the instrument pushing forward this power of capital market union? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, on capital markets union, I'm afraid there is no silver bullet. So there's no one solution which will solve all our problems with capital markets. So that's why we already have two action plans on the capital markets union, which we are implementing, and it ranges, through the whole list of issues. So, to put simply, the aim of the capital markets union is to put European savings to productive investments. So that one can say is the aim of capital markets union. So one thing is we need to ensure that European companies of different sizes have access to finance, and we build so-called funding escalator, how it's available for companies starting with startups and ending with large companies and mid-caps in between. We need to advance on concepts like securitization, allowing banks, in a sense, to sell securitized loans in the capital markets and focusing on their core business of lending to European companies. We need also other issues not directly linked with financial services, but still very relevant for development of capital markets, like at least a certain degree of harmonization of insolvency frameworks. We are now working on strengthening the retail investor participation in capital markets. So there are many things, and we need to do all of those things. So it's not like one or another. And as regards green bonds and other, so to say, EU instruments, well, this is also one of the tools for both advancing the capital markets unions, but also for advancing sustainable finance. That's, for example, why we are on our next generation EU package, we are issuing 30% of the bonds as green bonds, also to facilitate our sustainable finance agenda.
Yeah. Mr. Panetta, EU green bonds.
One comment to clarify an observation I have done before. It is not that we don't have capital markets in the European Union. We have developed capital markets in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands to some extent, in Italy. What we don't have is a European capital market. And the existing fragmented capital markets are built around the domestic sovereigns. We don't have a EU sovereign, we don't have a EU capital market. But why is the existence of a safe asset, of a sovereign, European sovereign asset important? Well, because in all markets, the risk-free asset, the sovereign bonds, are the benchmark to price risky assets. They are the benchmarks to price banks' funding and lending decisions. They are the benchmarks for the reference for arbitrage in FX markets. I could continue. So if you look at the past, all existing capital markets have been developed around a sovereign. So I think until we become fully aware that we need progress towards a central fiscal capacity, it would be very difficult to develop a European-wide capital market. The green bonds, yes, it may help, but the risk is that we will end up having a German market for green bonds, a French market for green bonds, an Italian market for green, which is good, but which is not what we are discussing about. If we want a full-fledged European capital market, I think that we should. The sequencing sometimes matters, and we started with the capital markets union. In the end, we have the potential progress towards a common fiscal capacity, which doesn't mean necessarily a full-fledged fiscal union, but we should progress towards a central fiscal capacity. Maybe we should reverse the order and think more why we don't get a capital markets union rather than trying to expand efforts or to increase effort and shooting all over the place in order to get a capital markets union.
That's the typical European story of small steps ahead, but is that fast enough to deal with the challenges we're facing? Yeah. Before turning the floor back to you, I would like to go to another question, which I think will be better addressed by you, which is the second most popular question, which is the role of international arbitration in balancing open autonomy and FDI screening here. So you talked about enforcing stronger this FDI screening, but what do you see as the role of international arbitration here, also to balance more public interest versus politicization of disputes? Is that a question I think is most...
Perhaps I'll just add one thing on
Okay.
green bonds before moving there.
Yeah, sure.
So, as you know, France has been launching green bonds around 2014, 2015, which, by the way, there's a huge demand for that. So it works really well, and we really want to see the European label on this, precisely because having a European label will avoid to have a green bond for France, one for Germany, and so on. Obviously, the basis will be the taxonomy, and as you know, there's been discussion about the role of nuclear energy, on which I think we'll be vigilant, to use a trendy word. And but it will be important to see this European label to develop the green bond market, because at the moment I think China is one of the biggest issuer too. In terms of politicization of dispute and protection of public interest, I would get back to what I was saying. I think what we need is a predictable doctrine. If you have a predictable doctrine with clear view on export as well as at bound foreign direct investment, that there's no politicization of dispute. The private and public interests are being protected at the same time, and everyone knows where they stand. There has been mixed view about international arbitration for quite a while now, and perhaps it will come back on the stage, but I think the main thing for me is that we have first this doctrine, and we can see very clearly where we go.
And a very clear, predictable doctrine here that would also reduce the uncertainty that corporate sectors...
No, you want some kind of forward guidance on this.
Yeah. But also, thanks for replying to the EU green bonds, and I think it's indeed a topic that's also worthwhile for a next Bruegel event. We're running out of time. which was really very predictable with this important topic and these important players here. I'd just like to have one last question here, also going back to some of the other questions here. So you'll be meeting, you said, the Chinese trade minister this afternoon here. So what message will you bring him to explain better this open strategic autonomy turn that the EU has taken here? So how does that reflect in your talk this afternoon with the Chinese Minister of Trade?
Yeah, well, thank you for this question. Well, on open strategic autonomy, it's not so new concept. Well, it's, I would say, evolving concept, but we had chances to discuss it with our Chinese counterparts, including with Vice Premier Liu He, who was co-chairing the EU-China high-level economic and trade dialogues in previous government. All in all, the message which I'm passing to Chinese counterparts, but not only to Chinese counterparts, that when we are devising, for example, our autonomous trade tools, also other autonomous instruments, we are very mindful to make sure that they are in line with our international obligations, that they are in WTO compatible, that they are non-discriminatory, that we are not setting rules, but not in a sense discriminating against any specific country, but that in a more conflictual geopolitical context, we need those tools, and we need to be able to defend ourselves if others are not playing by the rules. And clearly, just to re-emphasize this another point, as regards China, we have large and growing trade imbalance, and it's also something we need to address. So we'll be engaging in these discussions as well.
Thanks a lot. So I think one other message you can bring to the Chinese is that this panel really illustrated also the great consensus that we have within Europe on how to respond here, and that makes us a stronger player also for China to take into account here. So I would like to thank the panel members here, because your time is very precious. Opportunity cost of spending your time here is very high, but I hope the benefit was also at least the benefit for us was very substantial here. I hope also for you. I also like to point out that we, of course, in Bruegel will be continuing to monitor this topic and organize events around this here. So we're looking forward to keeping up this very important topic in lively discussions here. So thanks a lot again for your participation, and hope to see you again. Bye.